Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into something pretty significant, I think. A warning from billionaire Peter Thiel
Oh, yeah.
about a looming real estate. Well, he calls it a catastrophe,
Right.
not just in America, but in other developed nations. And the source material that we're looking at for this deep dive is excerpts from billionairepeterthiel.pdf, specifically a script from the America podcast where he lays this out.
Right. Yeah. And what we're trying to do here is break down, for you, the listener, Thiel's central arguments and understand the core factors that he believes are driving this potential crisis and who is most affected.
Exactly. And also for our listeners to understand why this carries weight. I mean, this guy's background is, co-founding PayPal, early investor, and Facebook. He has a history of kind of spotting these major shifts.
Right.
So that's why his warnings about real estate are something to examine.
Definitely.
And also he's framing his analysis using ideas from a 19th century economist named Henry George, which we'll get into.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just jump right into the core of his warning.
Yeah. What's the central concern he raises?
Okay, so basically he's saying that this traditional American dream of owning a home
Right.
is increasingly becoming unattainable
For sure.
for a large portion of the population,
Uh-huh.
specifically the lower middle class and younger individuals.
Yeah, makes sense.
And this isn't just a localized issue. He sees this impacting other developed nations with growing cities,
I sound
like Britain and Canada.
Yeah, and what's interesting is his explanation of why this is happening. I mean, he emphasizes the role of land scarcity combined with population growth in urban centers. And this is where the influence of Henry George really comes into play.
Yeah, so how does that all fit in?
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so essentially this perspective highlights that unlike things that can be produced,
Mhm.
land is a finite resource. So as populations grow
Right.
and concentrate in cities, you have more and more people
Sure.
competing for that limited supply,
For sure.
and it drives up the prices.
Right.
And he says that that leads to housing prices rising much faster
Makes sense.
than other costs, and then also wages aren't keeping pace
Definitely.
with this kind of rapid increase in housing prices.
Right. And he even gives an example that a 10% population increase in a city
Right?
could lead to potentially a 50% or greater jump in housing costs.
Yeah. And so who does he see as benefiting from this?
Yeah.
And who ends up bearing the cost in this scenario?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, he says that existing homeowners
Okay.
are the primary beneficiaries,
Okay.
particularly those who acquired property earlier.
Yeah.
So older generations like baby boomers.
Right.
They're seeing the value of their assets increase significantly.
Interesting.
But then you have the younger generation
Yeah.
and the lower middle class who are losing out
Mm-hmm.
because they face these increasingly unaffordable prices.
For sure.
And it makes that prospect of homeownership seem very distant.
Yeah.
And he describes this as a massive hit to these groups.
Right, because if housing costs are rising much faster than incomes, it's going to be so much more difficult for first-time buyers
Absolutely.
to enter the market.
Totally.
So what does he say about the role of general inflation in all of this?
That's a really important distinction that he makes. We hear about inflation affecting all these goods and services, but he argues that the main financial burden for the lower middle class isn't rising prices of everyday items.
Okay.
He points specifically to rising rent as the primary issue.
Okay.
Because for many in that income bracket, housing represents their single largest monthly expense.
Interesting.
So it's more about the cost of just having a place to live than it is about, broader inflation.
Right. And so why does he think rent is increasing so significantly? What's his explanation for this continuous upward pressure on prices?
Well, he points directly to the issue of supply, or rather the lack of supply. He says that restrictive zoning laws in many American cities are severely limiting the construction of new housing.
Right.
So even when there's high demand,
Interesting.
the regulations make it challenging to build enough new units to actually meet that demand.
I see.
And this creates a bottleneck. And, as basic economics tells us,
Right.
limited supply with high demand leads to higher prices.
So he's not just seeing these zoning laws as just, minor bureaucratic obstacles, but as a fundamental driver of this affordability crisis.
Yeah, he views them as a form of incredible wealth transfer
Wow.
from renters
Okay.
to landlords and upper middle class homeowners
Right.
who were able to buy in a less restricted market.
I see.
And he frames it as a reversal of the American dream,
Makes sense.
where instead of building wealth through homeownership,
Right.
you're perpetually paying rent.
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
contributing to someone else's equity.
Right. And this isn't just an isolated American problem.
Yeah.
This is something that he sees happening globally.
Yeah, he mentions Britain and Canada
Right.
as other examples of developed nations facing similar issues,
Mm-hmm.
where you have strict zoning regulations
Right.
and growing urban populations.
Makes sense.
But his analysis is focused on the dynamics of supply and demand within these urban areas, not on immigration policies, as some might try to interpret it.
Okay, interesting. And so it sounds like his concern goes beyond just like the financial strain on individuals. He sees like broader societal implications arising from all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. This housing crisis for him is not just about individuals struggling to afford rent or save for a down payment. He argues that it's reshaping opportunities within society
Right.
and widening the wealth gap.
Sure.
Unlike previous generations, young people can't necessarily rely on home ownership as a primary way to build wealth and achieve financial security.
Yeah, for sure.
And the lower middle class remains in a cycle of renting,
Mm-hmm.
unable to build equity and improve their financial standing. And so he really sees this as having long-term consequences for social mobility
Interesting.
and the overall structure of society.
So essentially, we're looking at a situation where the increasing difficulty of achieving home ownership, driven by land scarcity, population growth, and restrictive zoning laws, is creating a huge problem
Totally.
with some serious negative consequences, particularly for young people and the lower middle class, not just in America, but also other developed nations as well.
It's a stark warning,
It is.
and it brings up some really important questions, I think. So I'm curious for you, the listener. Is this housing crisis an inevitable outcome of urban growth
Right.
under our current systems? Or are there meaningful solutions out there that maybe Thiel hasn't addressed? Think about the long-term societal impacts of a declining rate of home ownership among younger generations and the lower middle class.
Right. What does that future look like?
Exactly. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. This is a conversation that needs to continue.
Definitely.
I hope you found it thought-provoking.
For sure.